Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to Stately Vaughan Manor, where Roger and I have returned. And today we're talking about Rocket Summer. Rocket Summer, which is coming our way in July of this year, 2024. That is the year, right? You go journeying around in Roger's time machine, it can be hard to keep track. But yes, we're talking about Rocket Summer, which is coming along in July of this year, and Rocket Summer is a thrilling new reading event. It's going to be thrilling. That is all about classic science fiction, and it has all of the exciting booktube event type things that you would expect, like weekly prompts. And every week we're talking about a different decade, more or less. Although the first week we're talking about science fiction that goes all the way to the beginnings of science fiction up through the 1930s. So the first week covers a lot of ground. I mean, you can go all the way back to Frankenstein or wherever, and all the way up through the 1930s. So that's a lot of time. So I have a pile of books here that I've set aside for Rocket Summer, and I don't know exactly which of these books I will be reading, but I will be reading from these books for Rocket Summer. So let's go through them, shall we? Let's go through these books and figure out what I'm going to read for Rocket Summer this year. It is going to be taking place at the same time that Book Trek is taking place. Book Trek is going to be taking place at the same time. So I'm going to be sneaking in all summer long, I'm going to be sneaking in some Star Trek books because it's the summer of Trek once again. But in July, I'm going to be focusing on classic science fiction for Rocket Summer. Now, one book I know for sure I'm going to read because it's part of Roger's cheap old book club. Roger has the cheapest book club around. Every month, Roger has picked a book to read, and all the books are cheap. You can get them for free on Project Gutenberg because they're all in the public domain. And the first book I'm reading is this big old book. This is... Which way is up on this book? This is Voyage to Arcturus. This is the fancy beehive edition of Voyage to Arcturus. And this was written in 1920. And from what I remember, it's kind of fantasy as well, or is it strictly science fiction? I don't know. It's been a while. But this is a big fancy pants edition of Voyage to Arcturus. And it is the only copy of this book that I have, so I guess I'll be reading the big fancy pants edition of it. So for sure, I'm going to be reading that. But everything else I have here are all mass market paperbacks, which seems appropriate for classic science fiction. So for the first week, from the beginning of science fiction up through the 1930s, I'm considering these books. I am considering reading H.G. Wells' A Time Machine again, because it just seems so appropriate for the first week of Rocket Summer. This is an awesome old Bantam Pathfinder edition. Yeah, these were cool paperbacks back in the day. I love The Time Machine. I think this book is fantastic. It's one of the first science fiction books I ever read. And H.G. Wells is popularly considered to be the father of science fiction. So, yeah, this would be appropriate. The Time Machine by H.G. Wells. I might read this again. It's very small. It's a very small book, so I should be able to get right through it. But there's this other book that I've been intending to read for the past 4 years, which is Jules Verne's Master of the World. This also includes Rober the Conqueror. And this is a book I've never read from Jules Verne. Jules Verne wrote a lot of books. More books than you might think, considering the fact that only a few of his books are usually reprinted. But he wrote a ton of books, and this is one of them, Master of the World. that I've never read. There are a lot of Jules Verne books I haven't read yet, but this is one of them. And this might be a book that I read at the beginning of Rocket Summer for the first week. So maybe, I'm not sure. Because also I think I might read this. This is Gulliver of Mars by Edwin L. Arnold. Fantastic Frank Frazetta cover there of Gulliver of Mars. This was originally titled, was it Lieutenant Gulliver? It was originally titled Lieutenant Gulliver Jones, His Vacation. He took a vacation on Mars. This is a book that many people believe inspired Edgar Rice Burroughs to write A Princess of Mars, because there are many elements in this book that are very similar to the things that happen in A Princess of Mars and in the Mars series. So it seems likely that Edgar Rice Burroughs read this book, but we don't really know. There's no real evidence that he did. It wasn't found in his library. He never talked about it. So who knows? Maybe he read this book. Who knows? But it's an interesting book on its own. I read it years and years ago. And so it's about time I revisit it, because frankly, I don't remember it all that well. So Gulliver of Mars, pretty good chance I'll read that. But what about Buck Rogers? There is the original Buck Rogers novel. This is Armageddon, 2419 AD by Philip Francis Nolan. So I might read this. This is like I said, this is the beginning of Buck Rogers. The famous character Buck Rogers originally appeared in this novel. This was turned into a comic book strip, and then it became the strip that it was known as Buck Rogers. And, you know, we got all those old movies and that goofy 1970s television show, all came from this. So I might read this, because I don't believe I've ever read this before. Did I? Maybe. But I'm definitely considering it for Rocket Summer. Then there is Edmund Hamilton's Crashing Suns. It's Crashing Suns by Edmund Hamilton. I like Edmund Hamilton a lot. He was just such a fun, pulpy science fiction writer. And look at that cover. That cover is amazing. So this is the perfect cover for Rocket Summer. I might read this just because it looks like so much fun. This paperback was published in the 60s, obviously. But the original stories are from 1928, 1929, 1930. And I think this is either a collection of stories or a fix-up novel. I won't really know until I read it. But there's Crashing Suns. That's definitely one to consider. And then there's this book that looks absolutely terrible, but it looks like fun terrible. This is The Greatest Adventure by John Taine. They found a lost world of weird monsters. It was a lost world of weird monsters. I mean, yeah, this looks like fun. Published by Ace. This was originally published in 1929. This originally was published in 1929. And it looks like it's probably a terrible book, but it looks like it might be fun. So, The Greatest Adventure, maybe. We'll see. So those are the books that I'm considering for the first week. The second week is the 1940s. So science fiction from the 1940s. And there are only a couple authors I'm really considering for the second week. One is Henry Kuttner. Well, actually, that's not true. I'm considering three authors, Henry Kuttner and C.L. Moore. Although Henry Kuttner and C.L. Moore, they were married. And very often they worked on each other's books. So it's hard to know if you're reading C.L. Moore, are you really reading Henry Kuttner? It could be kind of hard to know. But this first one is a book called Bypass to Otherness by Henry Kuttner. And this, again, very 1960s cover. This is a 1960s collection, but it's a collection of stories that were written in the 1940s. So, yeah, definitely I'm considering this because this has a bunch of stories in it that I don't know that I've read. Yeah, Piper's Sum, A Little Things, Nothing But Gingerbread Left, Housing Problem. I think I might have read Housing Problem somewhere. But there's a bunch of stories in here I've never read. So I might read this, bypass the otherness. And then, of course, there is C.L. Moore, and this is Judgment Night. Judgment Night. Which of these aliens and humans would survive? The Judgment Night by C.L. Moore. And this was published originally, copyright 1943. So it was copyright 1943. It was published as a book, I believe, in 1952. But it was originally published in the magazines, science fiction magazines. So Judgment Night by C.L. Moore, and possibly Henry Kuttner. He possibly had a hand in this book. Who knows? So, yeah, Judgment Night. But the other author I'm considering, other than those two, is Robert Heinlein. Robert A. Heinlein, who is a very good science fiction author who loves to talk about political ideas that I usually disagree with, but that's okay. Heinlein, this is Beyond This Horizon. Beyond This Horizon. This is a Heinlein book that I've never read. Never read it, but it is from the 1940s. This book was published in 1942, it looks like. 1942, 1948. So I don't know if this is a fix-up novel or not, but it is a novel. So Beyond This Horizon by Robert A. Heinlein. There's Heinlein there. Might read this. There's a strong possibility that I'll read this book. Next, hold on. Sorry about that. Wilkins, my valet, interrupted me and told me he has to go to sleep because, you know, the sun is coming up. So where was I? Oh, yes. Here is a collection of stories that was originally published in the 1950s, but it actually collects stories from the 1940s. And this is a fantastic cover. Assignment in Eternity by Robert A. Heinlein, which collects 4 stories that were written in the 1940s. And I don't think I've ever read any of them. And I've got a couple copies of this book, actually, and they are both very, very different as far as their cover design. This one's pretty awesome, actually. They're both pretty awesome in their own way. Don't know which one of them I'll read, but I'll read one of them. But yeah, Heinlein, Assignment in Eternity. I'm going to read this book probably. Okay, now I'm getting into the 1950s. And there are a lot of choices from the 1950s because there were so many great books published. You know, I just picked up a few of them, and I'm going to read from this pile of books for the 1950s, week 3 of the 1950s. So we've got Jack Finney and The Invasion of the Body Snatchers, which was a wonderful movie. Actually, they made a couple good movies off of this. At least 2 of them are good. The 1950s one was really good. The 1970s one was actually really good as well. Now, this is the original version of The Invasion of the Body Snatchers. Jack Finney did revise it at one point, I think probably when the new movie in the 1970s was coming out. But this is the original version of The Invasion of the Body Snatchers. I don't think he made too many changes. I think he only changed the dates, but I could be wrong. But this is the original version. The Invasion of the Body Snatchers. Fantastic story. And I have read this before, but it was a long time ago. And I think the version that I read was the one that came out when the 1970s movie came out. So this is the original one, The Invasion of the Body Snatchers. Next is another book by Henry Kuttner, and this is Mutant. And this came out in the early 50s, I think. What year did this come out? Let's see. This came out in 1953. 1953. And I don't believe I've ever read this book, but I believe this book is highly regarded. I think this is considered one of Henry Kuttner's best books. That's what I heard, I think. Anyway, it's Mutant from Henry Kuttner, which I suspect is probably about a mutant. We'll find out. Then we've got Trouble on Titan. There's Trouble on Titan. This book is by Alan E. Nourse. Saturn's tiny moon posed a deadly threat to Earth, and one interplanetary troubleshooter faced it alone. So he faced it alone. He's like an old Western hero on Titan. So that looks interesting. Great cover. So Trouble on Titan, there's trouble there. I might read that. But this one is one that I'm definitely interested in reading. This is by one of my favorite writers of all time, Richard Matheson. So this is The Shores of Space by Richard Matheson. These are science fiction stories by Richard Matheson. All the stories in here are from the 1950s. Am I right? I hope so, yeah. Most of them looks like they were published in the magazine of fantasy and science fiction in the 1950s. And the book actually was first published in 1957. So The Shores of Space by Richard Matheson. I like this author a lot, so there's a strong possibility I'm going to read this book. We'll see. But it seems wrong to do an event like this and not read something by Isaac Asimov. And here we have Pebble in the Sky by Isaac Asimov, a novel from the 50s that I have not read. I don't believe I read Pebble in the Sky. Somehow I missed this one. And to tell you the truth, I haven't heard too much about this book, so I don't know how great it is. But it is Pebble in the Sky by Isaac Asimov. There's a strong possibility I'll read it. This cover is fantastic. I love this cover. I have a couple editions of this book, but this is the one I prefer, just because that cover is so cool. Next, we have a book by James Blish that I have not read. James Blish, that also wrote Star Trek, the Star Trek series of adaptations of the episodes. He also wrote a ton of science fiction, and including this one, Vor. The awesome first alien demanded of Earth what it had no power to give. Vor. So, James Blish, Vor, a novel I've never read ever. So I might read this. We'll see. Maybe. But there's more Heinlein. There's a couple more books by Heinlein. There is Revolt in 2100. Revolt in 2100. I might read this, just so I can get prepared for the revolt that'll be coming our way in 2100. Might come sooner the way things are going. You never know. But be prepared. Read this book. Then we have a book that is similar, I believe, to Invasion of the Body Snatchers. This is The Puppet Masters by Heinlein. The Puppet Masters. We'll see. This is, I think, a very similar book, An Attack from Space, the day alien monsters invaded the world. So, an alien invasion book by Robert E. Heinlein. Maybe I'll read that. You let me know. But here's another book. This is Clifford D. Simak's Time and Again. And Shawn D. Standfast on his channel is doing a read-along of all kinds of Clifford D. Simak books. And I think this is the book actually for June, but I don't know that I'll be able to read it for June, because in June it's June on the Range and I'll be reading a bunch of Westerns. So who knows? If I don't get to this in June, which is frankly likely, maybe I'll read it this month, or maybe I'll read it in July for Rocket Summer. Who knows? Cool cover. And Clifford D. Simak is usually pretty great. So yeah, Time and Again. Maybe I'll read that. So that's the 1950s. I also have a big pile of books for the 1960s. And the first one on the pile is The Super Barbarians. Now, the 1960s is the decade where science fiction fundamentally changed. You could say it had been changing since the 1950s, but by the mid-1960s, with the new wave of science fiction, that was really the end of classic science fiction. And science fiction, evolved and changed and became something quite different. This still looks very much like classic science fiction. The Super Barbarians. And this did come out in the early 60s from John Brunner. When did this come out? 1962. Came out in 1962, and I might read it. It just looks so classic science fiction-y. But there's also that fabulous author Gardner Fox with The Hunter Out of Time, Cosmic Manhunt in 4 Dimensions. So Gardner Fox wrote a million comic books, you know, Justice League and Hawkman and so many other great comic books. And this is The Hunter Out of Time, which I have never read. You know, he wrote a lot of paperbacks that I never read. And Hunter Out of Time is one of them. So I might read this. It's from the 1960s. But there's also Frank Herbert, who was a pretty big deal. And in the 1960s, he wrote this. This is The Green Brain. The Green Brain, which looks like an interesting book. The Green Brain, I never really hear about this book. You always hear about the Dune books. But his other fiction, I usually don't hear too much about. And The Green Brain is one of those books that looks intriguing. It's probably really good because Frank Herbert wrote it. But I never hear about it, so I might read it. The Green Brain. I might read it. But I also might read Space Vikings. Why? Because it's called Space Viking. This is by H. Beam Piper. He wrote Space Viking. And that just, I mean, it just looks awesome. So I might read this in July. Or I might just save it for August, for Garb August. Because this is a book I have considered for Garb August before. Because, you know, it's about a Space Viking. But I might read this. This is Harry Harrison's Bill the Galactic Hero. Harry Harrison is an excellent science fiction writer who wrote the Stainless Steel Rat books. But he also wrote Bill the Galactic Hero. And I don't think I've ever read Bill the Galactic Hero. And I might read it. And this is a fantastic cover of this book. So I might read Bill. But I might also read Rogue Moon by Algis Budrys. I heard this book talked about by the Outlaw Bookseller. He talked about this book. And it sounds fantastic. So I've been intending to read this for a while. Rocket Summer would be a good opportunity. Oh, wait, but there's also The Tomorrow People by Judith Merril. He came back from Mars with a secret too terrible to remember. And that little tagline there just makes me want to read this book. I never hear about it, Tomorrow People by Judith Merril. I don't know if it's any good at all. Great cover. And I want to know, what is the secret that's too terrible to remember? I don't know. I hope I find out. But I probably won't if I read Mind Swap. This is Mind Swap by Robert Sheckley. Robert Sheckley's a really good writer. And this is Mind Swap with this fantastic cover. I mean, look at that. That's awesome. So I might read Mind Swap. Let me know if I should. But there's also this book by Fred Saberhagen, Berserker. There's Berserker. Now, this was a whole series of books. I think this is probably the only one that I have. Fred Saberhagen's Berserker, which came out in the late 60s, right? Copyright 1967. But this has stories in it from 1963, 64, 65, and 66. So this spans the 1960s. Berserker by Fred Saberhagen. And yeah, I might read this. I don't have any of the other Berserker books, but that's okay. I have this one, and this is the first one, so I might read this. I like Fred Saberhagen a lot. He's pretty good. So we'll see. Will I read this for Rocket Summer for the 1960s? I don't know, but I'm choosing from those books. That was a big pile of books. I probably shut up because I should probably shut up because I wasted enough of your time. I will catch you next time.